Jeremy Corbyn, it's a great honor to have you, to host you in our discussion today about the challenges before us, about the Labour Party, also about Cypriots in the UK, and about Cyprus, the Cyprus issue. Thank you for agreeing to do this interview.
It's a pleasure, and it's lovely to talk to you, albeit you're in Nicosia and I'm in London.
It's a shame. Next time we'll have to meet in person. And I'd love
to.
Okay, let's start with the beginning. What do you consider to be the main immediate challenges for Labour now, after you have left the leadership?
I think the biggest issue facing the Labour Party is the need to have an alternative economic strategy that relates to the needs of people in this country and represents a departure from the economic conformity that's facing Europe at the moment. Living standards of working class communities have fallen by about 20% over the past decade. And the wage demands that are being made by workers at the moment are usually asking for an inflation level pay rise, sometimes a bit more, but very few are even getting a settlement near an inflation level pay rise. And tomorrow we have doctor strike, and today the news has come that the second of the teaching unions has also voted to take industrial action in September onwards. And so we have a lot of activity going on with people trying to keep up with living standards. At the same time, we have unbelievable levels of stress and poverty in the community. There are food banks mushrooming everywhere at the moment, in schools, workplaces, hospitals, community centres, churches, the whole lot. And I was in one school this week in my constituency, and about 10 to 20% of all the parents access the food bank every Friday afternoon.
Wow.
In order to get food for the weekend. That's how bad things are. And so Labour needs to have an alternative that is about increasing corporation tax, that is about a wealth tax, that is about properly funding public services, because we're paying a huge price of private finance initiatives in the NHS and building schools for the future in the education sector, all of which amount to privatization. And because they were seen as a quick fix, bringing private finance in to build public institutions at the time, we're now paying the price. And I'll give you an example that there's a school in my area which was rebuilt under a private finance initiative deal. It's now spending nearly £500,000 a year on just maintaining that organisation, and that is the drain on public services. So we need Labour to be much more radical than it's been at the moment. And all we've had from the leader of the party and the shadow chancellor is they keep on saying they're a pro-business party. Well, nobody ever asked them to go on television and say they're going to be anti-business. What we wanted them to do was say they'll support public ownership of the key public services, mail, rail, water and energy. But they will also have an industrial strategy that empowers workers, not disempowers them. And so I think there's something badly lacking there.
But there is a kind of a Labour militancy that we haven't seen for many years. Trade unions, actions everywhere, response, also mass support and solidarity for ordinary people, for this action taken by trade unions that we haven't seen. Well, when I was living, I left more than 20 years when I was living in the UK. I have never seen anything like it. So this is something that is quite interesting that is happening now, but the Labour leadership is not there.
We're almost in a parallel universe where the Labour Party leadership is saying a great deal about the pro-business economy and spending a lot of time wooing the leaders of the business community. The trade union leaderships have moved into a much more radical position than they were a few years ago, driven by their members and demands. We now have more industrial strikes than we've had for a very long time. And we have a growth of trade union membership who are all looking for decent pay rises. But interestingly, all of the rallies that I go to, and I go to a very large number of trade union events, all of them include other causes. They include causes of refugee rights, anti-racist campaigns, housing justice campaigns, and environmental campaigns. And so the coalition of activists in the country are actually coalescing around the trade union struggles. Tomorrow afternoon, I'll be outside King's Cross Station in London with the Rail Maritime Transport Union in a campaign against ticket office closures. Now, that might sound a bit odd. Well, ticket offices represent the human face of the railway, mean that people whose first language is not English, don't have a smartphone, don't have a computer at home, aren't comfortable using machines, can actually talk to a human being and get some help. All those are due to be closed on the orders of the government to the rail companies, in exactly the same way that post offices have been closed and everything is moved online. And what the government and the opposition seem to have forgotten is that there's an awful lot of anger out there about the feeling of dislocation from society of a very large proportion of the public. And I'll be there tomorrow. And I think there's going to be a lot of people there who are not necessarily anything to do with the rail unions, but will be there because they have sympathy with the cause of keeping ticket offices open as the human interaction.
And you mentioned the rise of the importance of fighting against racism. Since my last visit in the UK, I have seen and I have witnessed racial abuse around me that I hadn't seen before. It is connected to the anti-migrant and anti-minority discourse and that followed Brexit, because it seemed to me that the whole Brexit debate was not about taking control and parliamentary democratizing the UK, or a critique of what was happening in Europe, which is a very problematic oligarchic system in any case, but it was all about nostalgia for empire and racism, and the immigration policy and the attitude towards minorities is a very negative one. What do you say about that, given that we
Very
have
thoughtful.
A prime minister who happens to come from a background, and a home secretary who comes from a migrant background, yet they are following the most anti-immigrant and racist policy we've ever seen in the UK?
Very thoughtful, very good question, Nicos, if I may say so. Number of things. Firstly, yesterday was the debate on the amendments proposed by the House of Lords to the immigration bill, which were amendments that would improve the bill or make it less bad, but not fundamentally defeat the bill. And we had a debate on that, and then we had voting for hours on end in Parliament last night. The government is trying to ram its legislation through, and essentially what the legislation says is that anyone coming to Britain by boat from France is going to be deemed illegal because they're breaching immigration law in coming in, even though there is a legal right to seek asylum in any country, anywhere, anytime, any place in the world. That's enshrined in the Geneva Convention. But the opposition to the bill is big from many of us who are activists in anti-racist campaigns for a very long time. And there's an awful lot of people who have become engaged and involved in this who are not necessarily hyper-political people, but feel uncomfortable with the idea that this country should receive somebody who's made a very perilous crossing to arrive in Britain, will then be put on a plane to Rwanda, probably to spend the rest of their lives in Rwanda, where there is insufficient infrastructure, nowhere to live, and so on. And so that has also provoked a racist right that says the government is quite correct in barring asylum seekers. So there is a rise of racism within British society, as there is a rise in racism across Europe. And I'm a member of the Council of Europe, go to the sessions of the Parliamentary Assembly in Strasbourg and argue and raise all these questions about the need for people to seek asylum. There is a sort of European paranoia about this, that some or other Europe is suffering more than anywhere else in the world. Well, there are 70 million refugees around the world. The minority of them, a quite small minority of them, are trying to get into Europe. The majority are in neighboring countries, often very poor and without the facilities to deal with them, such as Bangladesh and the Rohingya people, but there are many other examples. But in opposing the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, the British government is in danger of walking away from all of the conventions in which our rights are based: the Geneva Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the conventions on trafficking of young people, and the conventions on stateless persons. So it's quite a horrible scenario that's developing, where we have a government that's encouraging an anti-refugee sentiment, threatening to remove people to Rwanda in exchange for paying the Rwanda government a great deal of money to receive them, and then threatening to leave every international institution that is critical of Britain. It's not a very nice scenario. How much of this comes from Brexit? Harder to say. The referendum of 2016 was a pretty toxic affair. Boris Johnson and his friends went around the country rather bizarrely claiming that the European Union was defunding the National Health Service by £350 million a day, a figure that I can only guess was invented while he was eating his breakfast, and just stuck it on the side of a bus and said that's the figure. And Boris Johnson was and is very good at inventing figures, and our media is even better at accepting his words as some kind of truth and repeating them. The position the Labour Party took in 2016 under my leadership was that we would argue for a vote to remain, but also to reform the European Union, because I was concerned about a number of things, one of which was the economic strategy and the abominable way that Greece was treated, as well, to a lesser extent, as Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland during the financial crisis of 2008, but also some of its rules on state aid to industry, investment, and its penchant for privatization of the mail services and others. And so mine was one of criticism, but also supporting the principle of a social Europe. In the fog of the newspaper discussions about whatever ludicrous claims Boris Johnson and others in the Leave camp were remaining, a lot of this was simply not reported and not reflected upon by the general public at all, and the referendum result was what it was. But you're right that underneath it all, maybe some of us underestimated at the time, was that there was actually a cultural debate going on about the kind of society in which we want to live. And there was a massive split across the UK. My constituency, inner city, urban, predominantly social housing, 40% of the population live in social housing, about 30% live in the private rented sector. So it's not an area of intense private ownership, it is mixed. They're not all poor, but many people are. It voted over 75%, I think it was, Remain, and voted heavily demanding a second referendum. It is, as you probably gathered, a community that's under some stress. The equivalent communities, almost the mirror images of them, only 300 kilometres away, 200 kilometres away perhaps, in the Midlands or the north of England, with exactly the same social makeup, voted the mirror opposite. 75% Leave, 25% Remain, even though their problems were exactly the same. My effort was to try to unite people around principles that I've put forward. We all know what the result of the referendum was. Did that lead to a rise in racism? Yes, straight away. There was straight away an increase in racism, hostility towards European nationals that lived within our communities all over the country. Probably less so in my community than many others, but nevertheless, even in my area, that hostility was there. So we do have an issue to deal with. When I was discussing all this and the result of the referendum with party leaders in the Party European Socialists at our subsequent meeting in Brussels, they were all very critical of us for losing the referendum and so on. And I said, look, hang on a minute. Before you've finished all your criticism from afar, every single one of you represents countries where there's been deindustrialization, there's been a growth of systemic and intergenerational poverty, and there has been a growth of less skilled and fly-by-night work and companies that have developed from that. The gig economy has grown. Don't get away with the idea that in the Saarland, in the northern parts of France, southern parts of Belgium and the Netherlands, there aren't exactly the same conditions that exist in northern England. And that is a phenomena all across Europe. And that phenomena will either be answered by the far right, blaming it all on refugees and migrants, or it will be answered by the left with a coherent economic argument about how we can bring people together. We put that coherent economic argument, and less than a year later, we got 41% of the vote in the subsequent general election. Okay, we didn't win the general election. I know that very well. But by putting a coherent argument of redistribution of power and wealth, we did bring an awful lot of people on board with us. And that is got to be the way forward for the left all across Europe, not just Britain.
Well, I was there when you during those elections, and I was very disappointed with the result. It was so close, and it was such an opportunity.
You were very disappointed. What do you think I was?
Yes. Well, yeah. So the question is, I'm looking back now. I mean, I don't want to delve into what happened then, but looking back now, one of the criticism that was levied against the position that the Labour Party took under your leadership was that it wasn't as enthusiastic as possible, because it was close, and perhaps more enthusiasm, more positive approach would have changed. That's their argument. And to bear in mind that many Cypriots that I know, the vast majority of Cypriots voted to remain, as with most communities in of course in the south, so because they mostly live in the south, and also the connections with Europe and all of that. Looking back, would you say that you should have taken a clearer position on this, or was there anything else you could do? Because I don't know whether that would have changed anything, or whether it was a divided country and you did your best to unite in a bad situation.
I think we did our best to put forward a coherent and sensible approach to Europe. I'm not going to go out there and say the European Union is perfect. I don't think it is.
Well, no, do I.
And you probably don't either. And there is a legitimate position of remaining within the European Union, but being critical of it for the reasons I gave about their treatment of Greece and other countries at the time, which you would probably endorse as well. I think what we underestimated was the simplicity of the No campaign, the dishonesty of the No campaign, and the lack of challenge to it. But I was also very aware of the dangers for the Labour Party in getting on board with David Cameron and the Conservatives on a joint campaign. Thinking back to 2014, there was a referendum in Scotland on Scottish independence or not. Labour joined what was called the Better Together campaign and went around Scotland campaigning for Better Together jointly with the Conservative Party, and said, you know, the Scottish people are better off being together with England, Wales and Northern Ireland than they would be on their own. And there was a narrow result of rejection of independence for the more or less the current position. But that campaign destroyed the Labour Party in Scotland, because Labour supporters in the very poorest parts of Scotland, such as the East End of Glasgow, and many other places all across the central part of Scotland, which are a post-industrial society. There's mining communities, there's former steelmaking communities, and so on, that have all suffered very badly. They punished Labour for that. They said, look, you joined with the Tories because you thought that was the smart thing to do. Well, we didn't think it was very smart at all, and promptly voted SNP in very large numbers. And the Labour representation in 2015 in Scotland went from the vast majority of Scottish MPs down to one in 2015. Only one seat was retained by Labour. And I was very aware of the dangers of getting into a joint campaign with Cameron. So I absolutely refused to share platforms or anything else with him and put what I believe to be a realistic Labour socialist position as to why we would take the view we did on Europe. I was the one who did a great deal of campaigning. I traveled the whole country from rallies on beaches and so on. But I tell you what, with 10 days to go before the referendum, people in my team were saying, well, what do you think? And I said, well, sadly, I think this campaign is lost, because the Yes campaign, the official Remain campaign, the government's position was that everything is wonderful because we're in the European Union. A lot of people's lives are not wonderful. They're feeling very stressed. They're feeling very up against it. They don't think the EU solves their problems, and they voted no in very large numbers in the Midlands, the North, and the Northeast of Britain. But they did vote overwhelmingly yes in the south and in most of the big cities, and in Scotland. So it is a very divided look at it. I'll give you an example. The most Remain place in the country is Cambridge. The city of Cambridge voted something like 80–85% Remain. You'd only have to go 20 minutes in a car, 5–10 kilometers out of the center of Cambridge, and you'd be in areas that voted 80% Leave. That's the difference. And you have, I was very aware that to win a general election, we had to bring those groups together, because 2/3 of Labour affiliated voters voted Remain, but 1/3 voted Leave. We can't win an election without all of those Labour voters.
Now, moving on to the next situation, obviously there was a smear campaign personally levied against you, organized, with all these anti-Semitism charges, and this had a very negative effect on the way it was done. And you're still suffering from this. Is this over? Are you going to be the next candidate? Because I see you have overwhelming support from your local constituency. And
first of all, let's be very clear. I have spent my life fighting every single form of racism. My parents met in support of the Spanish Civil War. My mother was fighting the fascists in Cable Street in 1936 when they were after the Jewish and the Irish community, where the fascists were after them. And that has been my life, and it will be the rest of my life. And so the ideas of these horrible thoughts that were thrown at me by various newspapers and other people, frankly disgusting and disgraceful in every conceivable way. And my life will be, as ever, fighting against racism in any form, and for the right of people to stand by their own identity or habit. So that's my position. I also believe you have to be prepared to take a stance on justice around the world, justice for the reunification of Cyprus, justice for the people of Kashmir, justice for the people of Yemen, justice for the people of Palestine. And there are many other examples around the world. I could quote the Chagos Islands, I could quote Western Sahara, I could quote West Papua, all of which I'm involved in all of those campaigns. That doesn't make me very popular with some of those vested interests that have a different view. And so I'll continue that work. I am very proud to be the MP for Islington North, very proud of the connections I have with every community in my constituency. And whilst the Labour Party has said that I apparently not fit to be a Labour candidate in the next general election. What I'm getting back from the people of the area is they have a different point of view, and I'm listening to them, and I'm going to be available and around. So I'll be there.
Great.
And I look forward to seeing you.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of Cypriots who are living in your constituency, and it's one
Indeed.
of the traditional areas. And there's a lot of other communities: Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots, other minority communities, ethnic backgrounds. What's your message to them in terms of what you're willing to do? I mean, I know that you're very popular with Cypriots, both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. But what's your message in terms of what is to be done for those communities, particularly those in need in those communities, because they do face a lot of problems?
Yes, my involvement with the Cypriot communities, both Turkish and Greek speaking, goes back a very long way. In the 1970s, I was a councillor in Haringey for Haringey Ward alongside Green Lanes. And I was elected to Haringey Council in 1974. And a very short time later, we had the issue of the armed invasion of Cyprus, eventually a ceasefire, and then the effectively the line of control between the north and the south in Cyprus. Very large numbers of Cypriots came in to live in Haringey because there was already a Greek and a Greek Cypriot community, as well as a Turkish and a Turkish Cypriot community in my area. And the ward I represented included both. I condemned the invasion. I called for the reunification of Cyprus on probably the best way would be a federal way forward, as a way of recognition of the culture and tradition of both communities. And I did everything I could to support those communities, getting housing, getting permanent rights to remain. But I also noticed that many of the people that came were actually quite poor because they'd lost everything because of the military action that had taken place. And many, for example, were working at home, making clothes and selling them. And the council had a planning policy which didn't allow industrial standard sewing machines in the properties. And this became a huge issue, particularly in the ward I represented. And so the normal approach would be the councillor must support the planning department in making sure nobody has a machine in their house that could be a nuisance to a neighbour. This would be catastrophic for the living standards of those families. So I had a different approach. I set up a working group of clothing workers and childcare needs in the area, mostly women on it. And what we did was change the policy, allowed a quarter horsepower sewing machine in every flat if they wanted one, with a soundproof mat underneath it, which we were prepared to provide. And we set up daycare and nursery facilities for children so they wouldn't be in the potential danger of being near a working sewing machine. It worked. We got the community together. And I became chair of the Community Development Committee, and I also, with the support of Bernie Grant and a few others, managed to squeeze a great deal of money out of the council's capital budget, and we bought St Angela's School and turned it into the Haringey Cypriot Centre, which is still there. And every time I go to the Cypriot Centre, I'm just so proud of that night. We won that vote to get the money for that centre. So my involvement with the community goes back a very, very long way. And I obviously work with the Cypriot women's groups and many others. And there are probably less Cypriots living in my constituency than there used to be. There's what we call the A10 flight. They move to London and start off in Camden Town, then move up to Islington, then to Haringey, then to Enfield, then to Hertfordshire, and I guess they'll get to Cambridge next. But I meet Cypriots wherever I go who used to be in my area. Yeah. And so I was in a couple of years ago, I was in Lowestoft, and we went to this my wife and I went to this restaurant, and this guy comes rushing over to me, puts his arms around me, beaming at me, and said, "I used to live on Seven Sisters Road. What would you like to eat?"
So good to see. There's a lot of that background behind. Great. Let me come to the broader questions again now. There's a big situation with the war. The war that continues and is killing on a daily basis. I mean, obviously there are many wars. It's not just the war in Ukraine. There's a war happening now. There's an invasion by Israel. There's a attack now. There's all this happening in Africa as if nothing is going on. There are wars against poor migrants who are trying to cross over to come to Europe. So there's a war all around us. And you've been very vocal on this, and I think this is something that could unite people who are peace loving and they don't buy into this game of warmongering as if we are you. If you were to take a position on this?
Thank you for framing the question the way you have, because that's important. Obviously, the war in Ukraine is going on. Obviously, it's appalling and serious, and we'll come back to that in 1 second. But it's not the only war going on at the present time. There is a massive conflict going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Essentially, a war fueled by militia groups funded by mining interests, getting out coltan, potentially gold, and a lot of other stuff out of the ground of the Congo, which is one of the poorest countries in Africa with the richest supply of natural resources of any country in Africa. There's the war of Saudi Arabia, the bombing of Yemen, albeit there's a ceasefire at the moment. I hope that ceasefire holds, but a ceasefire isn't peace. It is merely what it says, a ceasefire. Again, Britain is selling billions of pounds worth of arms to Saudi Arabia, which have been used to bomb Yemen. There is what I mentioned earlier, the war going on in West Papua in Indonesia, where there is a very big West Papuan independence movement, which is now illegal, and anyone caught waving a West Papua flag can get life imprisonment as a result of it. What funds that? The mineral interests of trying to develop this huge mining interest in West Papua, which will, it's gold mining, which will pollute the rivers and so on and destroy the environment. Again, who's providing arms to Indonesia? USA and Britain primarily. And then there are many, many other wars, but I then mention the issue of the occupation of Palestine. Israel's armed forces occupy Palestine. If you or I were now in an office in Ramallah, and we decided after we'd finished this interview to step outside and go just outside Ramallah to get a coffee, get a meal, go and meet somebody, we'd probably pass 3 checkpoints on the way. We'd be detained for up to an hour, just going through a checkpoint. Across the West Bank, which is not very big, there are 600 checkpoints. There are 150 settlements. There are 70 more settlements planned. And the life experience of anyone born in the last 30 to 40 years has been that their life is one of military occupation with soldiers outside their homes driving around in armored vehicles. It's an occupation. It's got to end. Therefore, I voted against the anti-BDS bill that was put, boycott, divestment and sanctions bill that was put through Parliament last week, because I believe there has to be protests in support of the Palestinian people. And you know what? At all the demonstrations I've been to, there's been a very large presence of Jewish human rights groups, Jewish socialist group, Jewish Voice for Labour, and I frequently have meetings with Jewish human rights groups in Israel who are in support of the Palestinian people. And so it's getting a voice for peace and the way in which one can bring about a diplomatic end to conflict that's so important. But you have to also be prepared to pull economic levers where it can help. Now, in the case of the war in the Ukraine, it is appalling. 14,000 people had already died in the conflict in the Donbass before the Russian invasion. The Russian invasion took place, which is totally wrong and illegal in any way. And the war has gone on. I couldn't give you a figure of how many have died, but I suspect it's in the very large numbers of thousands that have died already. And a very large number of Ukrainian refugees have gone to Poland, to Romania, to Germany, to France, and some to Britain, and so on. And it is a horrible scenario. The West are pouring weapons into Ukraine. The Russian arms industry has redoubled its efforts to try and keep up. And we now have the situation where the US and others are supplying cluster bombs to Ukraine, or proposing to, and Britain has supplied depleted uranium-tipped missiles to Ukraine as well, which were used in southern Iraq after the Gulf War and have left a residue of 30 years of cancers as a result of it. So it's a horrible, horrible situation. Is there a way out of this, or is this a war that's just we're going to live with for decades and decades to come? There has to be a way forward. The UN did not succeed, or didn't try hard enough, in getting a ceasefire or any kind of negotiations before the invasion began, or even afterwards. There is an argument about whether or not Boris Johnson intervened last April to try to prevent a further escalation of the war or not. I don't know. Only he will know the answer to that, and President Zelensky will know the answer to that. But I'm impressed with the actions taken by the leaders of African countries, by the Latin American leaders, particularly President Lula da Silva of Brazil, and also the Pope in this, and to try to bring about a ceasefire. And the delegation of African leaders that went both to Kiev and to St. Petersburg, and they met both presidents to try and broker some kind of deal. So there has to be a process. Otherwise, we're going to be sucked into a more and more dangerous conflict. The two biggest threats are, one, an explosion will happen at one of the nuclear power stations in Ukraine, and that will set off something even worse than Chernobyl. The ones under threat are even bigger than Chernobyl. Or, even worse, nuclear weapons are available to Russia, nuclear weapons are available to NATO forces. There has to be a process that brings about peace of some sort. A ceasefire, not a solution, but at least a very big step forward. And what concerns me is there's almost no discussion by any of the leaders about peace. I asked Rishi Sunak in Parliament what he was doing to bring about a ceasefire. And his answer to me was, I could not disagree more with the honourable gentleman about this than anything else. What kind of answer is that from a prime minister to say he disagrees with me? I'd also accepted his point that a ceasefire is not peace. It isn't. It is what it says. It's a ceasefire, but it's the start. We've got to move somewhere on this. Otherwise, we're in for a horrible winter and more after that. I meet Ukrainian refugees in my community, in my constituency. They're lovely people. They're being well cared for, well looked after, and well received, and that's how it should be. And the same story all across Europe. If I may say so, that should be the same story for all other refugees who've sought a place of safety in Europe, but unfortunately it's not. And so many communities from Yemen, from Eritrea, from Sudan, from Ethiopia, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Syria, Libya, are all saying, well, they want that same kind of recognition and treatment.
But what about, okay, the final word, a few words, hopefully, of optimism about the future and the possibilities for the left, the possibilities left in the UK and broadly for Europe and the world. What do you see as the way forward, just as a final word for people who are, who live in this possibility of a dystopia live in their everyday lives?
My life has been and is and always will be one of political activism. And I'm constantly inspired by people in my own community who've been through horrible experiences, personal experiences of death, personal experiences of abuse, personal experiences of homelessness and poverty, but nevertheless work for the good of the entire community. The politics of the left, the politics of socialists, has to be about education, inclusion, and inspiration. And you do that in lots of ways. You do it through music, you do it through poetry, you do it through song, you do it through political ideas, but you do it also by listening to people, listening to what their hopes and their fears are, and include the history of all societies and all communities in our teachings. So yes, life is often very, very hard and very, very difficult for people. But then you look historically, and that sense of optimism of people during the worst days of their lives. Imagine those people that were loaded onto slave ships from Guinea, taken across the Atlantic, dumped in the Caribbean or the Americas, died on the way, many, or worked on sugar plantations or tobacco and so forth, nevertheless had hope. Hope through music, hope through song, hope through faith, and hope through organization. Eventually, they defeated the slave trade and slavery with it. Imagine the desperation of those people in the Warsaw Ghetto, in the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. The Nazis were everywhere. The cause was at one level totally hopeless, but the inspiration they gave to so many more to rise up against the oppression of the Nazis. Those that campaigned in the southern states of the USA to end racism there, those that campaigned for rights under apartheid, all around, there are people in the most awful situations in their lives that do have that sense of inspiration and hope. And you know what? There are millions of people around the world that don't want to live in poverty, don't want to live in debt, don't want to live without any hope. And it's that inspiration that's there. And so I spend my time and my energy working with groups that are fighting back with the industrial disputes and the housing campaigns and all the others that are going on at the present time. And I do a lot of visits to schools and colleges, and they always say, what's the thing we should be learning? I said, history, but with a critical eye. Look at historical processes with a critical eye and work out where your ideas, your beliefs, and your prejudices come from. And that is what strengthens us. And through the Peace and Justice Project, I'm doing all of that. And this year, coming out next month, we're producing a book called Poetry for the Many, in which we have a number of us, Maxine Peake, Michael Rosen, Len McCluskey and others have all selected poems that we like and then explained why we like them. And they're very varied. I'm not going to reveal them all to you now, otherwise you won't buy the book. But they are about inspiring people. And we've done quite a lot of events and meetings with this. It's very interesting, the variety of people that come along, because it's not a political meeting. At one level, it's a book about poetry, but at another level, it is very political. And so we're hoping people are going to be inspired by all of this. So when we do stuff together, we're inspired. When we sit on our own in isolation and shout at the television, shout at our computers, or become keyboard warriors, don't make us very happy. Get out there and do stuff together.
Jeremy Corbyn, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you this afternoon.